Hello, and welcome to Angels and Giants, a Lenten series for the parish of St. Olave's, Swansea. Over the next 5 weeks, we are going to be spending some time with some very mysterious and curious characters in the Bible. The Bible is, in fact, full of these strange and sometimes unexplained characters. And we're going to take some time to look at them and see if we can get our heads around who they might have been, or at least share in some of the reams of speculation about some of these characters that have been written over the centuries. There are 5 sessions. Our first session tonight is on biblical giants. And we are going to be looking at not metaphorically giants, but actual giants. And there's quite a few of them in the Bible, and that's the topic for tonight. Well, if you were to try to think of the most famous giant of the Bible, who would come to mind? I would be willing to bet that we would all say right away, Goliath, David and Goliath. If you have a Bible with you, and I encourage you to grab a Bible if you don't, pick your favorite translation and flip open to 1 Samuel in the Old Testament. The passage you want to find is 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're going to look at verses 1 to 11 and verses 50 to 51. I'm going to read these verses for you now, but I encourage you to follow along in your own Bible, and sometimes the different translations lead to some very different interpretations and can lead to some interesting conversations. So please follow along in the Bible of your choice. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And now we'll jump to verse 50. I think we all know the story. But just to summarize the very end here, David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, and they fled. Going to see on the screen now a depiction of this very, very famous, perhaps one of the most famous stories from our Bible, the battle between David and Goliath. This is a 19th century lithograph. As we all know, the Philistines were one of the several ethnic groups that lived in the land of Canaan. And they lived on the southeastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Let's take a few moments to just look at this map together. This comes out of the English Standard Version Study Bible. And hopefully you can determine with your eyes there that there's a couple of different colors. So the smallest portion, which is sort of a gray color, this is the portion in the middle, and this is the extent of Saul's kingdom. Saul, of course, being the first king of Israel. And then we see that in the time of David, who was the next king, we see that the land mass increases quite substantially. That whole green section was the parts added on by David. And within that green section, you will see the area towards the, right on the coast of the sea there, called Philistia, which is the land of the Philistines. And so this is the territory that we are talking about here in the story of David and Goliath. And I've included a red arrow there, and it points to a very approximate location where this battle between David and Goliath would have taken place. Ever since the Israelites conquered Canaan, after the desert wanderings, Moses and the people, of course, wandered through the desert for 40 years, and then finally, under the leadership of Joshua, entered the promised land and eventually would conquer it. Ever since that time, the Israelites found themselves in battle with various groups. And the Philistines, of course, were one of the groups that they often found themselves coming into conflict with. Before the time of Saul, of course, Israel was governed by judges, and then Saul became the first king, and as I mentioned a few moments ago, David, of course, being his successor. And there's a whole story that we will remember about the conflicts between David and Saul. And there are, in fact, three sort of separate little vignettes in 1 Samuel that talk about the rise to prominence of the young David. And they all come within succession of each other, but they all sort of emphasize a different aspect of how he came to prominence. There's that famous story of David and his brothers, and David sort of emerging as the least likely to become king, and yet was the one that was chosen by God. There's another story of David entering the court of Saul to be a musician. And then there's this story that we just read of David taking on the Philistine giant and then, of course, becoming quite famous for his achievement in killing him. So, Goliath was a giant, and we are told that he was 6 cubits and a span. Now, this translates to approximately 9 feet, 9 inches tall, so almost 10 feet tall. Just as a point of comparison, a famous giant of our own era, Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant, of course, was a famous wrestler, and he was, in fact, a very tall man. But Andre the Giant was, depends on what source you look at, but anywhere from about 7 feet to 7 foot 5 inches. So even at the most optimistic, tallest estimate, he still would, in fact, be quite short compared to Goliath. Andre the Giant was said to weigh about 500 pounds. You can only imagine what Goliath might have weighed. The spear head, just the head of his spear, weighed 600 shekels of iron, which would be about 15 pounds. And the coat of mail that he was wearing weighed 500 shekels, which would be about 125 pounds. Imagine carrying that weight around with you. Interestingly, about Goliath, there was, in fact, in 2005, an inscription found on a piece of pottery right at pretty much this site, at the site of Gath, where Gath used to be. And it is believed to read Goliath, which is really curious. At the very least, it would suggest that Goliath was a a common name or a name that was in some use at that time. And by the way, it dates from pretty much around the time that the story is supposed to have happened. As we continue our look at the giants of the Bible, we are going to increasingly move backwards in time. So we started with Goliath, who was at the time of King David, and now we're going to go back in time a few hundred years. We're going to go back to the time of Moses, and you will recall that the first several chapters of Deuteronomy are basically Moses recounting to the people of Israel all that they have been through to get them to where they currently are. So they are currently in the plains of Moab. They have not yet entered the promised land. They have been on their 40-year wilderness journey, and they've been through many ups and downs and many battles, and now they are waiting to enter the promised land. Of course, Moses will not be the one to take them there. It will be Joshua. But Moses is giving this great speech where he recounts all of these experiences. And one of these experiences is the story of Og, the king of Bashan. And Og, it turns out, was a giant. So open your Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 1 to 11. And again, follow along in whatever translation you prefer. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, but pick your preferred translation. Moses said, "Then we turned and went up the way to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to me, 'Do not fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land into your hand. And you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon.' So the Lord our God gave into our hand Og also, the king of Bashan, and all his people. And we struck him down until he had no survivor left. And we took all his cities at that time. There was not a city that we did not take from them, 60 cities, the whole region of Argob, the kingdom of Og and Bashan. All these cities were fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, besides very many unwalled villages. And we devoted them to destruction, as we did to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, devoting to destruction every city, men, women, and children. But all the livestock and the spoil of the cities we took as our plunder. So we took the land at that time out of the hand of the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon. The Sidonians call Hermon Sirion, while the Amorites call it Senir. All the cities of the tableland and all of Gilead and Bashan, as far as Selecah and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og and Bashan. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit." This is part of a speech from Moses to the people of Israel as they are preparing to, or at least waiting to enter the promised land. Now, you will see a map of the territory of Bashan, which is that whole green section. And you will see where we are in relation to the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And you will also see there the Jordan River. And this is, of course, where the people will eventually cross under the leadership of Joshua to enter into the promised land. But before they could do that, they needed to conquer this territory, the territory of Bashan. We hear about Og's great size in this passage. So Moses says that Og's bed of iron was 9 cubits long, which is about 13 feet, a little more than 13 feet, and 4 cubits wide, which is about 6 feet wide. That's a big bed and a very durable bed if it was made of iron, and we can imagine that the person who would sleep in it was a very large and tall man. There is also some thought that this, in fact, might be a reference not to his bed, but to his coffin. But it is not entirely clear. In either case, it was quite a monumental object. The bed is said to be in Rabbah, the capital of Ammon, which is, in fact, modern-day Amman in Jordan. Now, Og is said to be of the Rephaim. In fact, he's said to be the last of the Rephaim. Who are the Rephaim? Well, a very mysterious group of people. But they appear to be one of the ethnic groups that lived in Canaan before the conquest. We hear about them in several places, in Genesis and Deuteronomy, and in Joshua, and even in 1 Chronicles. Og is said to be the last of them, and we know, because of other references in the Bible, which we will talk about in a few moments, we know that they were considered to be giants, to be larger than the average person, mighty men, mighty warriors. And we're going to look at that in a few moments. As we continue our look at giants in the Bible, we're going to continue to go back in time. And so Og and his dealings with Moses, depending on how you do the math, but some people would say that this was around the year 1407 BC. This is the time just before the conquest. And now we're going to go back about 40 years towards the beginning of the Israelites' desert wanderings, and we're going to look at another story of giants. So if you turn to Numbers in your Bible and look for chapter 13, and we're going to look at Numbers chapter 13, verses 17 to 33. So the people are wanting to check out this land that they hope to one day enter. And so Moses sends out spies to take a look and see what might await them there. Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan. And he said to them, "Go up into the Negeb and go up into the hill country, and see what the land is, and whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad, and whether the cities that they dwell in are camps or strongholds, and whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be of good courage, and bring some of the fruit of the land." Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. So they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin to Rehob, near Lebo Hamath. They went up into the Negeb and came to Hebron. Ahaman and Shashai and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were there. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. And they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between two of them. They also brought some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol, because of the cluster of the people of Israel that the people of Israel cut down from there. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all of the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan." But Caleb quietened the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Then the men who had gone up with him said, We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So this is a fairly famous story of the 12 spies sent by Moses to scope out the land of Canaan. They come back and give their report. Two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, have a more aggressive approach and suggest that, in fact, they could take on these people. But the other 10 are much more cautious, and they describe a fairly horrifying sight of these giants and their viciousness and ferociousness. And so, indeed, it does prevent the Israelites from going in at that moment. Well, who did they see there? They saw the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed like grasshoppers to ourselves and to them. So they see there, or at least they say that they see there, giants, larger than normal, larger than average men, mighty warriors. The Anakim, we know from a few places, are indeed giants. And we know that the Anakim from Deuteronomy are counted as Rephaim. And remember that Og was of the Rephaim. And so it appears that these are related groups of people who have this tendency towards being very large giants. These are the same people that 40 years later Joshua will defeat, the Anakim. And we hear about this in the book of Joshua. And so the 12 spies see living in the land of Canaan the sons of Anak, the Anakim. And we are told that they are descended from the Nephilim, a group we have yet to discuss. And we also know that the Anakim are to be counted among the Rephaim, which includes Og and the people of Og. And all of these groups seem to be interrelated, the Rephaim and the Anakim, and appear to be descended from this mysterious people called the Nephilim. Well, who were the Nephilim? To address that, we need to go back in time much, much further. In fact, right back to almost the very beginning. So if you can flip in your Bible to Genesis, find chapter 6, and we're going to read Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals, and creeping things, and birds of the heavens. For I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Well, here we hear one of the more mysterious episodes of Genesis, this reference to the Nephilim. It's very cryptic and frankly, very difficult to interpret. There is no clear consensus who and what we are talking about when we talk about the Nephilim. So let's take a closer look. We hear that the sons of God and the daughters of man began to have relations with one another. Well, who are the sons of God and who are the daughters of man? There's a few different theories about who the sons of God might be. The first of those would be that they are angels, that these are angels that have gone astray, whereas man often makes the mistake of wanting to elevate himself to the level of God or the level of the angels. Here, perhaps, we are hearing about angels who've done the opposite. They have debased themselves. They have tried to come down to the level of man and to have relations with human females. And this is a bit of a strange concept. It seems somewhat improbable that angels and men could have such relations, but that is one of the theories about who the sons of God may be. And perhaps then the Nephilim, perhaps, are the offspring of these relations between angels and human women. There's another theory that the sons of God were simply a form of aristocracy, that these were people of great sort of renown, people that were looked up to and seen almost as having a divine status. There is another theory that the sons of God are Sethites, that is to say, descendants of Seth, and that the daughters of man are Cainites, which is to say, descendants of Cain. You will remember that Adam and Eve had 3 sons, Cain and Abel, and of course the famous first murder of humanity between Cain and Abel, and then later had Seth. And Seth, it is in fact from Seth that Noah is descended, and therefore his line would be sort of the righteous line, and the line of Cain would be seen as the unrighteous line. And so perhaps this is some kind of mixing between the sons of God, the sons of Seth, that is to say, the sons of Adam, and these somewhat unrighteous offspring of Adam, the sons of man, or the daughters of men, I should say. That was a view that was quite largely held by many people, including some of the more famous theologians of the church. But all of this is speculation. Whether the sons of God are angels, whether they are some form of aristocracy, or whether they are the righteous line of Adam as opposed to the unrighteous line of Adam, is speculation. And what's even more curious is how the Nephilim relate to this whole conversation. The word Nephilim is, in fact, translated as fallen ones, or those who are made to fall, or those who were cast down. Many English translations will, in fact, translate this word as giants. And when we think back to what we've already talked about, this is not at all unrealistic to think of them as giants, because we've already learned that they are related to the Anakim and the Rephaim, which are, as we know, giants. But Genesis actually doesn't say that they are physically larger than anyone else. Yet we can safely assume perhaps that they were. The curious thing, though, is who are the Nephilim in relation to this story? Are they the offspring of this somehow unnatural mating between the sons of God and the daughters of men? Or were they just simply there at the time that this was happening? Or are they, in fact, the sons of God themselves? It's not entirely clear what Genesis is saying to us in this passage. It's often been assumed that they were the descendants of this unnatural union. And this can lead to all sorts of speculation. Are the Nephilim, therefore, the descendants of angels and men? Or are they somehow the descendants of these righteous and unrighteous humans? We can't answer that question, but we know that they play a role in the story, and it would appear that they were certainly mighty men and quite possibly giants, from whom other biblical giants, it would appear, perhaps have descended, are the descendants of. We are faced with a problem, though. If indeed the Nephilim are the origin of biblical giants, and the Rephaim and the Anakim are somehow descended from the Nephilim and are therefore also giants, we are faced with a problem, which is that right after we hear the story of the Nephilim, we are led into the story of Noah. And of course, what happens in the story of Noah? Well, all of the earth essentially is washed out with a flood, except for Noah and his children and his children's wives. So one might be justified in suggesting that this is problematic. If the Nephilim were wiped out at the flood, how is it that their descendants somehow lived on in these other groups later in history? One theory that has been proposed, which is pure speculation and just a little bit of fun, is that perhaps the wife of Noah's son Ham may have had within her some of this Nephilim DNA, if you will. Because we learn from the Bible that it is from Ham and his wife that Canaan and his descendants came from. So perhaps if we wanted to speculate, we might think that somehow this Nephilim DNA lived on through Noah's son Ham and his wife and their descendants, who went on to populate the very regions that we later find biblical giants inhabiting. It's all a little bit of fun. What's the end story? What is the end of the story of biblical giants? How does this all resolve itself? We start with the Nephilim in Genesis, and then we find giants re-emerging, living in the land of Canaan when the Israelites go there to conquer it. And we find that the giants are in fact well established. We find Og, who is a giant, who is of the Rephaim. And later on, David encounters Goliath, who is also said to be a giant. Well, what happened to all of these giants? We don't know for sure, but the last we hear about giants in the Bible is, again, with David and his cohort. And so we're going to go back now to finish our session today, back to 2 Samuel. So we're going to go back forward in time to the latter part of David's reign as king. 2 Samuel chapter 21, and we're going to look at verses 18 to 22. After this, there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai, the Hushathite, struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jar-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. and he also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These four were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So we hear yet again David and his cohort striking down giants. And this would be the last we hear of them. Now, you may have noticed a slight problem in the story, because we hear just in this passage that Goliath the Gittite was in fact killed not by David, but it would appear by someone named Elhanan, the son of Jar-Oregim, the Bethlehemite. This is a curious problem. It depends on the translation that you are reading. And what makes it even more curious is if we look at the equivalent story, which is found in 1 Chronicles. And why don't we do that now? Take a look at 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 4 to 8. We hear a slightly different version. Very similar, but slightly different. If you go to verse 5, we'll see here that it says, "And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jair, struck down Lami, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite." So, slightly different tale, slightly different version of events. Did he kill the brother of Goliath, or did he kill Goliath himself? Just impossible for us to say for sure. Nevertheless, we see that as David's time continued, he is now the king of Israel, firmly established as the king, and he's still doing battle with giants and slays some of these giants. But that's the last we hear of them, and that's the end of the story as far as we know. Of course, giants do continue to exist. There are people that have a condition, as we saw with Andre the Giant, who are very tall and continue to grow past normal lengths. But I think we're talking about possibly something different here in the Bible. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the giants of the Bible. The story begins right back at almost the very beginning with the Nephilim, those mysterious beings that we learn about who are somehow connected to this getting together of the sons of God and the daughters of men. And then we pick up the story again at the time of Moses, when the people were wanting to explore the land of Canaan, and they sent those spies, and they see there the giants who are descended from the Nephilim. And then 40 years later, Moses will do battle with Og, who is, again, a giant, one of the Rephaim. And then the story continues a few centuries later at the time of David. David, as a young lad, does battle with Goliath, yet again, a giant. And then many more years into his time as king, David once again goes to battle with the giants. And that's the end of the story. And I hope you've enjoyed this time as we've looked at the giants of the Bible. Next week, we will gather again. And our topic next week is divine visitors. And we're going to be looking at that story of the three visitors to Abraham, as well as that mysterious opponent that Jacob wrestled with. So I hope you'll join me then.